David Ruffin generated hundreds of millions for mob-tied Vegas casinos as the voice of the Temptations. But when he demanded independent audits to recover his stolen royalties, syndicate bosses and record executives retaliated. They fired him, blacklisted his career, and financially strangled him into a severe crack cocaine addiction. At age 50, the legendary singer was dumped out of a car at a hospital, dead from an overdose, and tagged by police as a penniless John Doe. This is the factual reality of industry blacklisting. When David Ruffin was officially drafted into the Temptations, the internal chemistry of the group violently shifted. Stripped of the polish of a smooth, polite pop crooner, his vocal presence registered as a sheer sonic anomaly. Legendary songwriter and producer Smokey Robinson observed Ruffin in the recording booths and immediately identified the raw, unexploited capital residing in his chest. Robinson accurately classified him as a sleeping giant. Ruffin possessed a vocal architecture that was deeply paradoxical. It maintained a smooth, soaring, melodic capability, but the edges were heavily frayed, laced with a harsh, tearing, gospel-infused grit. It was the distinct sound of localized anguish, physical exhaustion, and street-level desperation. The executives in the corner offices recognized that if they could harness that specific frequency of suffering and package it within a pristine, upbeat pop arrangement, they could generate unprecedented streams of liquid capital. The theoretical hypothesis was brutally tested and confirmed in the winter of 1964. Smokey Robinson entered the control room with the sheet music for a new composition titled My Girl. He bypassed the other established lead vocalists in the group and handed the assignment directly to David Ruffin. The ensuing recording session was a seismic event in the history of the American entertainment complex. When the red recording light activated, Ruffin did not simply execute the lyrics, he attacked them. He transformed a straightforward, optimistic love song into a towering, emotionally devastating cinematic performance. He utilized the rough, tearing edge of his tenor to inject a terrifying sincerity into the track. The juxtaposition of the sweet, highly orchestrated string section against the raw, unpolished grit of Ruffin's voice created an irresistible commercial product. The track was pressed, shipped, and released in late 1964, detonating on the global market in 1965. My Girl did not just climb the charts, it obliterated them, securing the #1 spot on the Billboard Hot 100. The financial and cultural impact was immediate and staggering. The Temptations were instantly elevated from a successful regional rhythm and blues act into an international corporate franchise. They began packing massive, prestigious venues across the globe. Television networks clamored for their appearances. The physical vinyl was moving by the millions, generating a torrential, uninterrupted river of wealth that flowed directly into the heavily guarded accounts of the Motown syndicate. At the exact center of this massive financial vortex stood David Ruffin. The corporate apparatus immediately pushed him to the absolute forefront of the stage. He became the undeniable magnetic focal point of the brand. But the executives fundamentally failed to understand the psychological consequence of elevating a man who possessed a razor-sharp, fiercely independent intellect. Within the Motown corporate architecture, the concept of the group was sacred. The assembly line demanded uniformity. 5 men wearing identical suits moving in flawless, engineered synchronization. The uniformity was designed to ensure that no single human being ever became larger than the corporate trademark. If every man looks and moves the same, every man is replaceable. David Ruffin looked at this structure and actively, physically rebelled against it. Bypassing the formalities of a press release, he communicated his rebellion by engineering a highly specific piece of stage equipment. Ruffin invented and introduced the custom four-headed microphone stand. While screaming audiences perceived a brilliant theatrical prop, forensic observers of the music industry recognized a profound, highly aggressive political statement. The mechanical design of the stand was a physical manifestation of his growing ego and his razor-sharp awareness of his own market value. The apparatus allowed the other four members of the Temptations, Otis Williams, Paul Williams, Melvin Franklin, and Eddie Kendricks, to remain clustered tightly together around a single pole, executing their background harmonies and synchronized routines. They were physically bound to the collective. Ruffin, however, took a separate, unattached microphone for himself. This simple mechanical separation allowed him to break formation. While the group remained anchored to the four-headed stand, Ruffin physically detached himself from the corporate uniform. He gripped his microphone, dropped to his knees, threw his microphone in the air, and threw himself across the stage with a kinetic, hyper-masculine theatricality that bordered on violence. He was actively visually signaling to the global consumer base, and more importantly, to the men operating the ledgers in Detroit, that he was not merely a component of the machine. He was the engine. He was physically demonstrating that the other four men were his background singers. The four-headed microphone stand was the exact moment the sleeping giant fully awakened to his own sovereign leverage. The deafening roar of the crowds explicitly confirmed his hypothesis. Ignoring the synchronized walking, the audiences were visibly paying exclusively for the visceral, bloodletting agony of his voice. Ruffin looked out at the sold-out arenas, calculating the box office receipts in his head. He looked down at the weekly controlled allowance checks the Motown management apparatus was handing him. The arithmetic was glaring, insulting, and entirely unacceptable. He ceased to view himself as a replaceable, compliant worker on Berry Gordy's assembly line. He realized that his biological vocal cords were the primary asset subsidizing the luxury vehicles, the sprawling estates, and the rapidly expanding portfolios of the executive tier. The applause did not humble him, it radicalized him. He recognized that whoever controlled the stage controlled the capital, setting the precise psychological foundation for a brutal, highly dangerous collision. The front man was preparing to turn around, walk directly into the corporate boardroom, and commit the ultimate unforgivable industrial heresy, demanding to count the gold. Far beyond mere musical genius, the architectural foundation of the Motown empire rested entirely upon a flawless, airtight system of financial containment. Berry Gordy understood that if he allowed his roster of young, economically disenfranchised artists to directly handle the millions of dollars they were generating, they would rapidly achieve financial independence. An independent artist does not follow orders. Therefore, the syndicate established a highly sophisticated fiduciary firewall known as International Talent Management Incorporated, or ITMI. To the outside world, ITMI presented itself as a benevolent, prestigious talent agency dedicated to protecting the interests of Motown's artists. In forensic reality, ITMI was a closed-loop, vertical monopoly designed to intercept every single dollar before it reached the biological workers. ITMI booked the tours, managed the accounting, paid the taxes, and issued the weekly allowance checks. The corporation was effectively acting as the employer, the talent agent, the accountant, and the bank simultaneously. When a member of the Temptations wanted to purchase a house in Detroit or a new Cadillac, ITMI would facilitate the transaction. They would front the capital, but the corporation frequently retained the actual deeds and titles. The artists were generating unprecedented global wealth, yet they were living entirely on corporate credit, heavily mortgaged to the very machine they were powering. David Ruffin, observing the world from behind his isolated four-headed microphone stand, possessed a street-level intuition that quickly pierced this corporate camouflage. He recognized that the applause in the arenas was not translating into sovereign equity. His rebellion began with a calculated, highly visible demand for hierarchical restructuring. Ruffin was actively monitoring the executive decisions being made in the corner offices regarding the label's premier female group, the Supremes. He watched as Berry Gordy formally rebranded the trio as Diana Ross and the Supremes, permanently elevating the lead singer above the collective and granting her a superior degree of leverage and brand equity. Ruffin looked at the sales figures for My Girl, Ain't Too Proud to Beg, and Beauty is Only Skin Deep. He knew precisely whose vocal cords were driving those records to the top of the Billboard charts. He marched into the executive suites and demanded the exact same contractual billing. David Ruffin and the Temptations. The Motown executive tier flatly, categorically refused. Transcending simple aesthetics or marketing strategy, this refusal functioned strictly as a matter of total industrial control. Diana Ross was deeply integrated into the corporate power structure, highly compliant with Gordy's vision, and viewed as a safe, predictable asset. David Ruffin was an entirely different biological mechanism. He was volatile, fiercely independent, and profoundly suspicious of authority. Giving Ruffin his name on the marquee meant officially acknowledging his superior leverage. It meant giving a structural promotion to a man who was already showing terrifying signs of political consciousness. Denied his title, Ruffin immediately escalated his insurgency. He began to physically and logistically secede from the corporate collective. He refused to travel on the standard company-issued tour bus with the other 4 members of the Temptations. He purchased a highly customized mink-lined limousine, complete with his iconic trademark glasses painted on the exterior doors. He hired his own driver. He would arrive at sold-out arenas separately, walk onto the stage just as the music started, execute his flawless, explosive vocal performance, and immediately return to his sovereign vehicle, entirely bypassing the dressing room camaraderie. Eschewing the behavior of a pampered diva throwing a tantrum, his actions constituted a deliberate, highly aggressive physical blockade. He was demonstrating to the syndicate that he operated outside their jurisdiction. He was a contractor, not property. The final fatal collision occurred when Ruffin moved past the optical demands and struck directly at the central nervous system of the Motown empire, the ledger. Ruffin officially demanded a comprehensive independent audit of International Talent Management Incorporated. In the late 1960s, within the racial and economic architecture of the American recording industry, a black artist from the Deep South demanding to inspect the financial ledgers of his corporate handlers was not viewed as a standard contract dispute. It was classified as a lethal, systemic threat. Far from merely asking for a raise, he was actively interrogating the fundamental legitimacy of the entire Motown financial apparatus. He demanded to know exactly how much gross revenue My Girl had generated globally, and he demanded to see the precise mathematical formula ITM I used to deduct their exorbitant management fees, recording costs, and travel expenses before handing him his allowance. If the executives permitted David Ruffin to bring an independent forensic accountant into the Hitsville offices, the entire illusion of the Motown family would instantly detonate. The audit would definitively expose the recoupment traps and the phantom debt. It would provide empirical proof of the multi-million-dollar extraction. Worse, if Ruffin successfully audited the books and secured a massive financial settlement, every other artist on the roster, Marvin Gaye, Stevie Wonder, the Four Tops, would immediately demand the exact same transparency. The corporate syndicate was staring down the barrel of total financial collapse. They concluded that the biological engine of the Temptations had to be surgically removed to save the corporate body. However, Berry Gordy and the executive tier did not want to fire Ruffin directly and risk a public relations disaster or a direct confrontation with their most lucrative asset. Instead, they deployed their masterpiece of psychological manipulation. They weaponized the other members of the Temptations. The management apparatus initiated a series of closed-door meetings with Otis Williams, the pragmatic, deeply compliant founder of the group, and the other members, deliberately refusing to frame Ruffin as a hero, fighting for their collective financial freedom. Executives successfully painted him as a dangerous, arrogant liability whose demands were going to infuriate Berry Gordy, potentially causing the label to withdraw their promotional funding, repossess their homes, and destroy everything they had built. They utilized the exact same survival fears forged in the Detroit projects to turn the group against their own frontman. The executives successfully convinced the collective that Ruffin was not trying to save them. He was trying to sink the ship. In June 1968, the tension reached its breaking point. Ruffin missed a scheduled performance in Cleveland, Ohio, prioritizing a solo appearance at a local venue to support his new girlfriend. For the corporate syndicate and the deeply paranoid members of the group, this minor infraction was the perfect, highly justifiable pretext they required. Omitting any intervention or formal warning, the syndicate executed a swift, ruthless industrial amputation. Ruffin was officially terminated from the Temptations. The syndicate had already prepared his replacement. They immediately drafted Dennis Edwards, a brilliant hard-edged vocalist from the Contours, shoved him into the tailored uniform and pushed him onto the assembly line. The absolute terrifying efficiency of the Motown machine was proven in real time. The biggest vocal group in the world amputated its most recognizable face, and the touring schedule did not miss a single beat. When David Ruffin realized he had been replaced, he did not accept the termination quietly. In the ensuing months, he executed desperate, heartbreaking attempts to reclaim his throne. He would purchase tickets to Temptations concerts, sit in the front row, and the exact microsecond the band began playing his signature songs, he would physically vault onto the stage, snatch the microphone from Dennis Edwards' hands, and sing the lead vocals himself. The audiences, deeply loyal to the authentic voice of their trauma, would erupt in deafening applause, but the applause could not override the corporate ledger. Ruffin was eventually escorted off the stages by heavy security. He had challenged the masters of the assembly line, and he had been violently ejected from the factory floor. However, the true horror of his punishment was just beginning. The Motown Syndicate had fired him from the group, but they utilized the ironclad legal architecture of his original contract to ensure he remained their exclusive property. They locked the doors of the Velvet Prison, preparing to subject him to a slow, agonizing process of systematic starvation. The architectural brilliance of a velvet prison lies in its invisibility. Upon terminating David Ruffin in 1968, rather than physically locking him in a cell or granting him sovereign freedom to negotiate elsewhere, the Motown executive tier utilized the impenetrable legal density of his original contract to hold him hostage in plain sight. He was contractually bound to remain a solo artist under the Motown umbrella. Initially, the label capitalized on the massive public shock of his departure, releasing his solo single, My Whole World Ended the Moment You Left Me. The song was a massive commercial success, ironically monetizing the exact corporate exile they had just engineered. But once the initial wave of publicity subsided, the syndicate initiated a slow, highly calculated process of systemic strangulation. To destroy a solo artist without explicitly firing them, a recording label simply turns off the oxygen supply of marketing capital. The massive promotional budgets that once guaranteed Ruffin magazine covers, primetime television slots, and heavy national radio rotation were quietly diverted to other, more compliant artists. His subsequent albums were released into a deliberate, engineered vacuum. Ruffin possessed one of the greatest biological acoustic instruments in the history of recorded music, but without the corporate distribution network actively pushing the vinyl, his records languished. He was allowed to record, but he was not allowed to succeed. The executives were actively demonstrating the absolute futility of his rebellion. They were showing him and every other artist on the roster that a front man without the corporate machine is simply a man screaming into the dark. The psychological devastation of this corporate containment was absolute. David Ruffin was a man whose entire internal architecture and self-worth were inextricably linked to the visceral, deafening roar of a sold-out arena. Stripped of his band, starved of his promotional resources, and forced to watch from the sidelines as the Motown machine continued to generate billions without him, his psychological defenses entirely collapsed. The introduction of highly addictive narcotics into his ecosystem during this period must not be categorized as a recreational indulgence or a cliché of rock star excess. It was a desperate, highly destructive chemical deployment designed to anesthetize the profound humiliation of his exile. By the 1980s, the localized anesthetic of choice in the decimated urban landscapes of Detroit and Philadelphia was crack cocaine. The drug offered an immediate, violent surge of dopamine that temporarily overrode the agonizing reality of his hijacked legacy. But the chemical mathematics of crack cocaine demand a relentless, compounding financial toll. Ruffin was caught in a lethal crossfire. His primary source of income had been structurally amputated by the label, while his chemical dependency required a continuous daily influx of liquid capital. As his personal finances completely disintegrated, he collided with the ultimate unforgiving enforcement arm of the American government, the Internal Revenue Service. During the peak years of his success with the Temptations, the corporate accountants at ITMI were supposed to be managing his tax liabilities. But the ledgers were a labyrinth of recoupable advances and undocumented deductions. When the massive touring revenue stopped, the IRS did not audit the Motown executives. They audited the isolated, chemically dependent biological asset. Ruffin was hit with a staggering, insurmountable tax lien exceeding $310,000. He possessed no corporate legal team to negotiate a settlement. The man whose voice defined an era of American culture was officially convicted of tax evasion and sentenced to a federal penitentiary in Terre Haute, Indiana. It was the ultimate horrifying victory for the corporate syndicate. Their most rebellious worker had been reduced to a federal inmate wearing a prison uniform, while the songs he made famous continued to generate uninterrupted profit for the boardroom. The absolute enforcement of the corporate blockade during the 1980s resulted in a stark, highly uncomfortable racial and financial paradox within the American music industry. By 1985, David Ruffin and Eddie Kendricks were mathematically destitute, effectively barred from generating substantial domestic revenue. The temporary disruption of this embargo did not originate from a sudden burst of philanthropic guilt from the Motown boardroom. It was executed through a temporary jurisdictional bypass engineered by a rival corporate conglomerate, specifically facilitated by the white pop duo Daryl Hall and John Oates. Recognizing the supreme acoustic value of the original Motown architects, Hall and Oates requested Ruffin and Kendricks to collaborate on a live album to celebrate the reopening of the Apollo Theater in New York. When RCA Records, the massive corporate entity backing the pop duo, initiated the contractual paperwork, their legal and accounting departments collided with a terrifying reality. The men whose voices were the foundational pillars of mid-century American soul music did not possess basic union health care, functional savings, or standard royalty protections. Utilizing their massive, undeniable commercial leverage, Hall and Oates forced the RCA legal team to issue standard, highly regulated union contracts to the exiled singers. For a brief, highly documented window, culminating in a globally televised performance at the 1985 Live Aid concert in front of 100,000 people in Philadelphia, the original architects were pulled out of the underground economy. They were paid fair, unintercepted session rates and direct performance royalties, successfully bypassing the predatory ledgers of International Talent Management Incorporated. The structural irony was devastating. It required the legal intervention of two white pop stars operating under the protection of a rival corporate ecosystem to secure a fundamental, legally compliant paycheck for the most iconic black vocalists of the era. However, this intervention was not a permanent emancipation. It was merely a localized corporate loan of their talent. The exact moment the promotional cycle for the RCA Live album concluded, the temporary protective shield evaporated. Ruffin and Kendricks were immediately returned to the commercial void instantly suffocating again under the unyielding weight of their IRS tax liens and the permanent Motown blacklisting. The system allowed them a brief gasp of oxygen on a global stage, only to legally shove them back under the water. The microsecond their commercial utility to the rival conglomerate expired. The paradox of Ruffin's corporate exile reached its structural, highly televised climax not in a courtroom, but under the chandeliers of the Waldorf Astoria Hotel in New York City. In January 1989, the Temptations were officially inducted into the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame. To the global viewing audience, the sight of David Ruffin standing at the podium in a tailored tuxedo, clutching a glass trophy alongside his former bandmates, was broadcast as the ultimate triumphant validation of a legendary career. The industry appeared to be officially apologizing for the exile, welcoming the prodigal son back into the highest echelon of American culture. However, a forensic analysis of the event exposes it as a masterpiece of institutional gaslighting. Behind the prestige, the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame operates as a powerful trade organization, funded and directed by the very elite executive tier that engineers these exploitative contracts. The induction ceremony operates as a highly lucrative corporate marketing catalyst. By officially enshrining an artist, the institution permanently elevates the historical prestige of their master recordings, directly triggering massive immediate surges in back catalog sales, digital reissues, and lucrative commercial licensing deals for the publishing companies. When David Ruffin accepted that trophy, he was mathematically destitute, actively suffocating under the weight of his IRS tax liens, and fighting a severe, untreated chemical dependency. The executives applauding from the VIP tables were entirely aware of his terminal financial and biological condition. Yet the institution they controlled offered zero financial safety nets. There was no retroactive royalty adjustment, no corporate pension plan, and no health insurance policy attached to the award. The industry formally required Ruffin to physically authenticate their television broadcast, utilizing his raw charisma to legitimize their brand while offering him absolutely nothing but a piece of glass. They successfully sanitized the brutal history of his exploitation, proving that the corporate establishment is perfectly willing to immortalize a biological asset, provided the immortality costs the ledger absolutely nothing. The absolute subjugation of the exiled frontmen was ultimately enforced not by physical barricades, but by the ruthless application of federal trademark law. When David Ruffin, Eddie Kendricks, and Dennis Edwards engineered their independent reunion tours in the late 1980s, they possessed the undeniable biological acoustic hardware that had generated the Motown empire. However, they collided with a terrifying legal reality regarding intellectual property. The corporate syndicate, alongside the compliant founding member Otis Williams, had legally registered and completely monopolized the trademark The Temptations. Under the Lanham Act, the corporation possessed the exclusive federal right to dictate who could commercially operate under that marquee, regardless of whose vocal cords actually recorded the foundational hits. When the trio attempted to book domestic arenas, the Motown legal department immediately deployed aggressive cease and desist orders and filed federal injunctions. They effectively weaponized the judicial system to ban the original architects from utilizing the exact brand they had physically built. The trio was legally forced to market themselves under convoluted diminished titles, such as the former leads of the Temptations. Far exceeding a minor semantic issue, this legal maneuver served as a calculated financial decapitation. By legally stripping them of the trademark, the corporation instantly downgraded their billing status, drastically reducing their box office leverage, their booking guarantees, and their overall market value. The corporate entity legally proved that the paper trademark, held in a filing cabinet in Los Angeles, superseded the biological reality of the men standing on the stage. The corporation owned the history. The men who bled to create it were legally reduced to counterfeit assets within their own profession. Yet the human instinct for survival, particularly in an artist of Ruffin's magnitude, is terrifyingly resilient. By the late 1980s and early 1990s, he orchestrated a desperate final attempt to reclaim his sovereign capital. He reunited with Eddie Kendricks and Dennis Edwards, the other exiled architects of the Temptation sound, recognizing that the American recording industry had permanently closed its doors to them. They bypassed the domestic market entirely and booked a grueling, highly lucrative month-long tour across the United Kingdom. The European consumer base did not care about Motown's internal politics or IRS tax liens. They worshipped the authentic, foundational pioneers of soul music. The UK tour was a massive sold-out triumph. For a brief, intoxicating window, David Ruffin was back holding the microphone, executing his legendary vocals, and generating raw, unintercepted capital. Because of the decades of severe financial trauma, the predatory accounting of ITMI, and the ongoing threat of IRS asset seizure, Ruffin had developed a profound, entirely justified paranoia regarding banks and corporate financial institutions. He refused to deposit the earnings from the UK tour into a standard account. According to highly credible eyewitness accounts from his inner circle and the firm assertions of his family, Ruffin converted his share of the tour revenue into physical capital. When he boarded the flight to return to the United States in late May 1991, he was carrying a leather briefcase packed with traveler's checks and a specialized money belt strapped directly to his physical body containing upwards of $40,000 in raw cash. He was operating as a walking sovereign financial vault. He landed in the United States and immediately traveled to Philadelphia. The city contained a network of highly dangerous underground narcotics operations that he frequently utilized. On the night of May 31st, 1991, carrying the entirety of his newly acquired wealth, Ruffin entered a crack house in a severely impoverished sector of the city. The corporate media narrative insists that what happened next was a simple, tragic overdose resulting from a binge. However, a forensic analysis of the timeline and the physical evidence points directly toward a highly coordinated lethal robbery. Stripped of the anonymity of a standard addict, he was a highly recognizable international celebrity, actively carrying massive amounts of liquid capital into a desperately violent environment. In the early hours of June 1st, a black limousine abruptly halted in front of the emergency room at the hospital of the University of Pennsylvania. The doors were thrown open, and Ruffin's unconscious, rapidly failing body was dumped onto the concrete. The driver immediately accelerated and vanished into the city. When the medical staff initiated their emergency protocols, The forensic discrepancies became glaringly, terrifyingly obvious. The leather briefcase containing the traveler's checks was gone. The specialized money belt that had been strapped to his torso was missing. The hospital personnel emptied the pockets of the multi-million-dollar recording artist who had just returned from a sold-out international tour. They found exactly $53. The physical condition of Ruffin's clothing presented an even darker reality. According to subsequent investigations and statements from his family, the clothes he was wearing when he was dumped on the concrete were heavily stained with blood. In any functional legal jurisdiction, the arrival of a high-profile individual stripped of his known capital, dropped off by an unidentified vehicle and covered in blood, immediately triggers a severe criminal investigation. The clothing constitutes primary, critical forensic evidence in a potential homicide or aggravated robbery. The administration at the hospital of the University of Pennsylvania did not secure the clothing in evidence bags. They did not immediately contact the homicide division of the Philadelphia Police Department to preserve the chain of custody. Instead, operating under a protocol that defies all logic of forensic science, the hospital's staff took David Ruffin's blood-stained clothing and immediately discarded it as medical waste. They physically destroyed the only material evidence that could have proven that the pioneer of Motown was beaten, robbed, and intentionally given a lethal chemical dose to secure the $40,000 strapped to his waist. Presented with an unconscious black man with a history of narcotics use and zero physical evidence of an assault, the Philadelphia police executed the path of least administrative resistance. They officially closed the investigation almost instantly, ruling the death a tragic accidental overdose. The localized criminal element successfully executed the physical robbery, but the broader American system, the hospital administration, and the police department acted as the silent, highly efficient cleanup crew. The ultimate horrifying culmination of this multi-decade extraction protocol occurred under the harsh fluorescent lighting of the medical examiner's office. Because the architects of the robbery had stripped him of his customized money belt and identifying documents, the hospital administration was forced to execute their standard protocol for unidentified casualties. They tied a stiff manila tag to the toe of the man whose acoustic frequency had fundamentally altered the global entertainment industry. The ink on the cardboard read, John Doe. The Motown syndicate had systematically stripped him of his band, his publishing rights, and his promotional capital. The streets of Philadelphia simply executed the final physical robbery, stripping him of his last $40,000 and his actual legal identity. To correct the hospital's ledger, local law enforcement was forced to extract fingerprints from the deceased and transmit the biometric data to the Federal Bureau of Investigation in Washington, D.C. When the federal database generated a match, the localized tragedy instantly mutated into a massive international media event. The corporate press immediately mobilized, splashing the news across front pages and primetime broadcasts. However, the media apparatus did not execute a forensic investigation into the missing capital, the discarded, blood-stained clothing, or the highly suspicious circumstances of his arrival at the hospital. They eagerly embraced and broadcast the exact narrative that the recording industry required, a simplistic, highly sanitized cautionary tale of a brilliant but inherently flawed artist who inevitably succumbed to a crack cocaine overdose. They blamed the biological asset for his own destruction, completely shielding the corporate architecture that had engineered his isolation and starvation. As the news of his death circulated, the immediate logistical necessity of arranging a funeral exposed the absolute, terrifying financial vacuum of Ruffin's estate. When a multi-million-dollar corporate chief executive or a heavily protected pop star passes away, their estate relies on massive, diversified portfolios, trusts, and corporate life insurance policies to manage the transition. David Ruffin's estate consisted entirely of phantom debt. The probate attorneys attempting to settle his affairs did not find hidden offshore accounts or lucrative royalty streams. They found the crushing permanent weight of the $310,000 tax lien levied by the Internal Revenue Service. The man whose voice had provided the soundtrack for an entire generation of American youth, whose vocal cords were actively, at that exact moment, generating licensing revenue for television commercials and film soundtracks across the globe, was biologically dead and mathematically destitute. The Ruffin family was informed by the funeral directors in Detroit that the estate could not cover the basic foundational costs of a standard burial. They could not afford the wood and the fabric required to construct his casket. The multi-billion-dollar recording industry, populated by the executives who still owned the master tapes of My Girl and Ain't Too Proud to Beg, stood by in absolute calculating silence. They offered no corporate bailouts. They did not authorize an emergency advance to bury the pioneer who had built their headquarters. The intervention came not from the boardroom, but from a fellow survivor of the industrial assembly line. Michael Jackson, at the time the most powerful and wealthiest sovereign artist on the planet, quietly contacted the Swanson Funeral Home in Detroit. Jackson possessed a profound, intimate, and highly traumatic understanding of the Motown extraction protocol. Having been processed through the exact same corporate machinery as a child with the Jackson 5, he recognized the systemic cruelty of allowing a founding father of soul music to be buried in a pauper's grave simply because he had lost a war against the ledger. Jackson immediately, without requesting public credit, wired the capital required to cover the entirety of the funeral expenses, ensuring Ruffin would be laid to rest with a modicum of the physical dignity that the industry had violently denied him in life. The funeral service, held at the New Bethel Baptist Church in Detroit on June 10, 1991, was a masterpiece of sickening, highly orchestrated corporate hypocrisy. The heavy oak doors of the sanctuary opened to admit a parade of international superstars, powerful politicians, and the elite executive tier of the recording industry. The street outside was heavily barricaded by the Detroit Police Department to hold back thousands of weeping fans. Inside, the flashbulbs of the paparazzi illuminated the tailored suits of the men who had actively starved David Ruffin of promotional capital. Barry Gordy, the architect of the Velvet Prison, sat in the pews. Stevie Wonder and Aretha Franklin delivered deeply emotional, soaring musical tributes. The surviving and former members of the Temptations stood near the casket. The environment was saturated with tears, flowery eulogies, and public declarations of profound loss. To the untrained consumer watching the broadcast on the evening news, it appeared to be a beautiful, unified celebration of a beloved family member. But to a forensic observer, the sanctuary was a crime scene. The executives weeping in the front rows were the exact same individuals who had fired Ruffin for demanding an audit. They were the men who had utilized predatory legal contracts to block his solo career. They had watched him drown under the weight of the IRS debt and refused to throw him a financial life preserver. Now that the biological threat of his political consciousness had been permanently neutralized by death, they could safely, comfortably arrive in their limousines to publicly mourn the tragic loss of a legend. They were performing grief for the cameras, successfully laundering their own complicity in his destruction. The absolute ruthless efficiency of capitalism dictates that an asset must be optimized, even in death. While the choir sang over Ruffin's casket in Detroit, the executive boardrooms in Los Angeles and New York were already executing their posthumous monetization strategies. The exact microsecond the medical examiner signed the death certificate, David Ruffin transformed from a highly volatile, financially desperate liability into a flawless, frictionless, highly lucrative corporate product. The major labels immediately mobilized their manufacturing infrastructure. The heavy steel stamping presses were activated. The master tapes from the 1960s were pulled from the vaults, digitally remastered and repackaged. The marketing departments aggressively capitalized on the massive surge of public attention generated by his sudden tragic death. They rushed new greatest hits compilations and in memoriam box sets to the physical retail chains. They wrote sanitized, romanticized liner notes praising his tortured genius, actively selling the aesthetic of his suffering to a consumer base eager to purchase the authenticity of a ruined life. The cash registers began to ring globally. The corporate syndicate was successfully generating massive, entirely clear profit margins from the acoustic residue of David Ruffin, completely unburdened by the financial liability of a living human being who required a percentage of the sales to survive. They were acting as highly efficient financial parasites feeding upon a corpse. The true, terrifying finality of Ruffin's financial subjugation did not occur at his funeral. It was executed silently in the sterile environment of a federal bankruptcy court years after his burial. When a civilian dies with insurmountable IRS debt, the government liquidates their physical assets, homes, vehicles, bank accounts. But when an iconic recording artist dies destitute, their most valuable asset is intangible, the legal right to their own name, likeness, and future performance royalties. Because Ruffin's estate was completely insolvent, crushed under the weight of the $310,000 tax lien, the federal government seized the rights to his intellectual property to auction it off to the highest bidder in order to satisfy the phantom debt. The corporate syndicate that originally engineered his poverty was waiting precisely for this legal mechanism to trigger. Motown and its parent conglomerates did not have to negotiate with Ruffin's children or heirs to secure the rights to his legacy. They simply entered the bankruptcy proceedings and purchased the total unencumbered rights to David Ruffin's name, image, and future royalty streams for a microscopic fraction of their actual market value. This was the ultimate flawless execution of the corporate trap. By legally absorbing his estate out of bankruptcy, the labels ensured that when the digital streaming revolution arrived 2 decades later, generating billions of dollars from algorithmic playlists on platforms like Spotify and Apple Music. Absolutely 0% of the revenue generated by My Girl or Ain't Too Proud to Beg would flow to Ruffin's bloodline. The corporation had successfully utilized the federal tax code to legally launder the theft of his legacy, permanently locking his descendants out of the generational wealth that his biological vocal cords continue to generate every single second of every day. The destruction of David Ruffin is not an isolated historical tragedy. It is the defining evergreen blueprint of the American entertainment complex. The industry relies heavily on the consumer's willingness to accept the illusion of the stage. They require the public to believe that the music is a product of pure, uninhibited artistic expression, separate from the brutal mechanics of corporate commerce. But the autopsy of David Ruffin destroys that illusion entirely. When a modern listener drops a stylus onto a vinyl record or taps a screen to stream My Girl, they are not merely consuming a timeless piece of mid-century pop music. They are actively engaging with the acoustic evidence of a brutal, unwinnable war. They are hearing the voice of a man who possessed terrifying revolutionary courage. Ruffin did not fail because he was weak. He was destroyed because he was too strong. He looked at the masters of the corporate assembly line, recognized the immense, irreplaceable value of his own biological instrument, and demanded equity. He demanded to read the ledgers. For this act of industrial treason, he was systematically exiled, financially suffocated, and legally hunted until his physical body collapsed on a concrete floor, stripped of its capital and its name. The ghost of David Ruffin is a permanent, blood-stained warning to every generation of artists that follows. In the boardrooms of the entertainment empire, a brilliant voice will earn you a plaque, but demanding the keys to the vault will guarantee your execution. The music is immortal, but it was paid for entirely with the blood, the sanity, and the stolen wealth of the man standing behind the four-headed microphone.